Hi there, everyone. Welcome to week 15. We are almost through the semester. This is going to be the only video for this week. You're only going to get one video for next week. I am attempting to, make the workload, especially in these very difficult times for you all, manageable. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a short, video for this week, only a single video, and we're only going to do a single video for next week. As I mentioned previously, these 2 weeks we're going to be able to read an entire book by Kant, namely the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And we'll discuss the precise meaning of that title in just a moment. Just as a brief reminder, I just want to let everyone know that, information about your final paper is posted. You should have seen that announcement for week 14 where I, mentioned that this was up. I also moved it to the top of the page on Canvas so that you know the due date, I believe, is December 10th, but just check the syllabus because it will have the definitive date. I also wrote the date in the week 14 announcement. So if you just go over to your announcements tab in Canvas, you should be able to find it. Okay, so your final paper is coming up. And for the next couple of weeks, we're going to discuss Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And this is going to be the last book that we get to tackle with each other this semester. And there's a reason why this comes at the end. Is because, as we discussed last week when we were talking about the introduction to the critique of pure reason, Kant truly believes that with the Prolegomena and with the critique of pure reason, he has really outlined the basis for all of the fundamental problems that we have discussed up to this point in the semester. Kant believes that all of the modern philosophers that we have discussed up to this point, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Hume, Berkeley, and so on, they've kind of done metaphysics, they've made various claims about the nature of fundamental reality, but they have not yet asked the prior question of how is metaphysics as a science possible? And that is really Kant's question. One important note about the use of the word science in this discussion, as well as Kant's Prolegomena in general. Kant, he would really like to discuss the scientific nature of the endeavor that he is engaged in. And to English ears, that sounds a little weird, right? Because something that we've kind of discussed and that has been constant throughout the semester is that you just cannot learn anything metaphysically about the nature of reality through experimentation, right? That's what, is sort of the dividing line between physics and metaphysics. Physics are those things that we can directly investigate, right? And develop hypotheses, have experimental procedures for confirming or denying that hypothesis, right? All of that is possible, but in metaphysics, there is nothing like, an experiment in this sense where you can decide, okay, is Spinoza's definition of substance right, or is Descartes' definition of substance right? That just doesn't happen. Instead, metaphysics is a kind of reflective endeavor, right? You get the whole picture of reality, and then you kind of ask, well, what is that like? And that is ultimately the question that has motivated the various analyses of substance that we've seen up to this point, right? Whenever they're trying to describe what substance is, they're trying to get at, okay, what is the fundamental nature of all of this stuff, right? All of the same things that I see and hear and experience that have these manifold qualities. What is the underlying basis for all of those various qualities. And the idea is that if we can come to a discovery about the fundamental nature of reality, then everything else can follow from that, right? If I can learn the very foundation of everything in the same way that physics, effectively describes interactions between bodies by segmenting the parts, right, and getting to the smallest possible part that we can investigate. That's an explanatory project for physics that is continuing to this day, right? It's just that we no longer have atoms, but we have various subatomic particles that we take to be the ultimate constituents of the universe. And of course, this is very familiar to us as readers of Leibniz. His theory of monads also tries to get to, the smallest possible, the simplest possible element, and then build the whole universe out of these smallest possible elements. So, that's really what has been going on in the semester up to the point of Kant. And Kant would say that this is true even in the empiricists, even if they take, a slightly more skeptical tone towards investigations of fundamental reality. To the debate about whether or not things are primary or secondary properties or qualities is really a metaphysical debate. And so, from Kant's perspective, what the entire tradition that we've discussed up to this point takes for granted is that metaphysics as a science, as a body of knowledge, is possible. And so the reason why Kant uses this word science and why German authors in general, might talk this way, even though it sounds a little odd to us, is because the German word for knowledge, or for science, is just Wissenschaft. So that just means, like organized body of knowledge. So in the German language, you can just as easily talk about like literary criticism or something like that as being a science, right? That doesn't mean that they make hypotheses. That doesn't mean it's like a sort of investigation like physics or chemistry or anything like that. It just means that it's a body of knowledge that has something like a method that produces something like results in our knowledge, right? And so he has a very minimal idea for what science is, in a sense. It's different than, what we would hear to like kind of English ears. And so to ask how metaphysics as a science is even possible is to ask, like, how could this process where we try to discover the underlying nature of reality, how can that ever yield knowledge instead of superstition? What is the principle, the principal basis that justifies these sort of inferences? Because they seem special and different. And it seems like the debates in metaphysics are way more intractable than debates in physics or mathematics, right? Mathematics, for example, during this period continually developed more and more tools and an increasingly specialized skill set and toolbox for mathematicians was developed, from the period of roughly the 16th century to the 19th century. And you could say the same thing about physics, that there were an enormous amount of physical discoveries, including like Newtonian physics basically holds more or less for objects of our size, so not the extremely large or the extremely small. And that is extraordinarily impressive. There are very few epoch-defining moments, in terms of like the way that we get our knowledge. But in mathematics and physics, this has genuinely taken place. There is a fundamental difference in how all of the early moderns approach the world from the ancients, for example, because the moderns are invested in the idea that the world can be at its core physically explained, right? One way to think about the project of the early moderns, as we've discussed it so far, is that they take the physical investigations and the mathematical investigations that we've discussed and take them to their limit, right? So, like, if we expanded the scope of all of our physical inquiries beyond even that we could, experimentally confirm or something like that, what are the consequences? And this was a lot of the way that early modern metaphysicians sort of built their metaphysical theories. And so what's going on is there is always a latent comparison between metaphysics, physics, and mathematics. There's this comparison between mathematics and metaphysics because both of them are a priori inquiries, right? Spinoza and Leibniz constantly tried to compare their inquiries to geometry, right? They wanted to claim that they had the same certainty. Their inquiries had the same certainty as geometry. And we saw a similar claim from Mendelssohn last week, where he said that, metaphysics just concerns qualities, whereas mathematics concerns quantities. And so this analogy between metaphysics and mathematics is critical to how the early moderns, and especially the rationalists, conceived of their whole project. And similarly in physics, what makes Newtonian physics work, right, is that there are certain Newtonian laws. And these laws are not laws that you can directly, experimentally confirm. To the contrary, the way at least the early moderns thought about these laws is that they were things that made experiments make sense, right? Go back to, for example, the Du Châtelet reading that we had. From her perspective, Newtonian laws are the assumptions that are made in physical investigations. And here again, this is very similar to Hume in some way, in Hume's inquiry about causality. We assume, these metaphysical principles in our experimental sciences. And so she saw a very close connection between metaphysics and physics. We could also talk about like Descartes or Cavendish, these are things that we've really investigated together, all semester. And so what this book is, really more than anything else, is a reflection on that tendency in early modern philosophy. Where does that come from? Is it justified? To what extent are they really analogous? And ultimately, what Kant's argument boils down to in this piece is that they are not analogous. And the disanalogy between metaphysics and its sort of like rival disciplines of physics and mathematics is that metaphysics tries to take us beyond the limits of possible experience, right? It tries to get at the fundamental core of everything that we could never directly experience. The substance underlying the properties or something like that, you know what I mean? Whereas mathematics and physics have a direct application in our experience. That doesn't mean that they are justified by our experience. It doesn't mean that, we could conduct experiments or that our experience makes, these things possible or anything like that. To the contrary, the categories, which is how Kant thinks about pure a priori concepts, they make experience possible. It's only because our experience is organized in a certain way that we can have anything like a coherent experience at all. I just want to give a brief example. I don't want to dwell on this point because it's something that we're going to be basically talking about for the next 2 weeks. But think, for example, about causal relationships. If our experience was not structured in a way that prior events are related in some way causally to future events, then we couldn't even have anything like a coherent idea of what experience was. It would just be things like kind of shimmering, popping, flashing in and out of existence or something like that are not connected by any causal nexus. And that's just not what we mean when we talk about our experience. Our experience is something that, although often escapes or evades us in some way, we don't think of as in principle inexplicable. When I see smoke, I assume and I know that a fire caused the smoke. And in fact, I wouldn't have anything like a coherent concept of smoke at all. I wouldn't be able to understand it as it figured in my experience if I did not relate it to fire and heat and air and so on, right? It's precisely because things in our experience are interrelated with one another that the application of the causal principle is legitimate. But Kant thinks that what the mistake of the early modern philosophers was to assume that these principles that are legitimate within our experience, so within the domains of mathematics and physics and our everyday life, then have legitimacy when extended beyond our possible experience, right? We infer from the fact that we need to experience these things this way. Oh, well, they must really be that way, metaphysically, right? And Kant is challenging that inference in particular. And so it's easy to see from this example the crucial, relationship between Kant and Hume. Kant says that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. In other words, Hume's question about causality, right, really began for Kant to undermine, if I don't have any direct knowledge of causal relations, then isn't that not only a problem for causality, that's a problem for metaphysics as a whole. And so, according to Kant's narrative, Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber means that it took him away from this Leibnizian sort of belief about pre-established harmony and stuff like that reflected Kant's, very early beliefs, to his own later critical system. Hume raised this skeptical question. But what Kant does, and I've written that down here, is that Kant expands and extends the problem of Hume's fork to all metaphysical knowledge whatsoever. How do we get the inference that the application of these categories that works in our experience works beyond our experience? And so the way that Kant frames his question is, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? And we got to break this down. So first, there's this distinction between analytic and synthetic. We've discussed this a little bit recently because it's also figured in some previous philosophers. Analytic judgments or propositions are what Leibniz called truths of reason, or what Hume called relations of ideas. So these are truths that you can know not by expanding or amplifying your knowledge, but just breaking it down and analyzing it, right? So if I said something like, I'm going to go to the protest for the first time next week, right? You can then infer from that statement that I did not go this week, right? You didn't need to know anything else, right? If you just understand and break down what you've heard, you'll realize that the fact that I, didn't go to the protest this week is already contained in a way in the idea that, I'll be going to the protest for the first time next week. And so for analytic judgments, all you need to do is analyze the subject, and you'll see that the predicate is contained within it. And for those of you who are Leibniz heads, this should be very familiar from the primary truths essay, because this is how Leibniz describes truths of reason. And this is also how Hume describes relations of ideas. Now, in contrast, synthetic judgments are those that teach you something genuinely new about the concept. So, Harry the cat is black, right? Why is this a synthetic judgment? Because you could break down the concept of Harry's cat as much as you want, right? What belongs in that is not any particular species of cat or something like that, right? You have to go beyond the idea of just Harry's cat to also then learn that it's black, right? And so synthetic judgments for propositions are those which amplify our knowledge. They extend our knowledge of the world, right? They go beyond what is merely contained in the subject, right? So to something that I have to discover out in the world. So this is the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments. And so now we have to get to the next adjective, which is a priori, and discuss the distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. This is probably something familiar to you all, because we've discussed it previously, but just to go over it again, a priori knowledge is knowledge that is gained independently of experience, justified independently of experience. So importantly, think about math, right? Mathematical propositions, 3 plus 4 equals 7, or something like that, that is something that you learned at a particular moment in your experience, right? Like maybe you're in, elementary school or whatever, you're like 4 or something, I don't know. I really have no idea about early childhood education, but, say you're learning it around then. What makes 3 plus 4 equals 7 true is not the fact that you learned it when you were 7 or 4 or whatever, right? Because you could have learned it at a different time. That's not an essential fact about the mathematical truth. That's a contingent fact about when you, the psychological subject, happen to learn it. And so these a priori versus a posteriori, they're not about the origin of your ideas, because Kant will agree all of our ideas come from experience in some way, right? That's the origin of all ideas. But the justification in the extension of certain concepts, certain ideas, certain propositions does not stem from our experience. They are not essentially justified by our experience, right? Mathematical facts, they don't become true when you learn them. They don't become true when you're, learning arithmetic in preschool or kindergarten or whatever, right? That's only the contingent fact about when you happen to learn them. If you're not thinking about their origin, the origin of those ideas, but their justification, that's totally independent of when you happen to learn it. And it's independent of your experience. And one way that you can know this is that they're true for all times and all places. By contrast, a posteriori knowledge or judgments or propositions are those that are justified by our experience. And so their kind of knowledge is always non-essential, right? So, the example I gave earlier of a synthetic judgment is a synthetic a posteriori judgment, because the way that you would learn that the cat is black is through experience, right? And so one thing that Kant's pointing out is that there's been a tendency on the part of early modern philosophers to conflate these terms, to think that all a priori knowledge is analytic and that all synthetic knowledge is a posteriori. And who in particular is guilty of that? Leibniz and Hume. And Kant says something like, well, if Hume had thought more closely about mathematics, then he actually would have arrived at my system, right? Why does he say that? Well, because Kant thinks that it is absolutely clear that mathematical judgments are both synthetic and a priori, right? We should not conflate analyticity and whether or not something is a priori. We should not conflate these two categories. Why? Because it is possible to have a synthetic a priori judgment. In other words, one that amplifies our knowledge and that is not justified by our experience. Crucial that we don't, for Kant, conflate these two different types of adjectives, because it's important that he's asking specifically about the synthetic a priori judgments, right? Okay, so this is what lets us draw out a little chart that I've written here. You have the two different dichotomies, analytic and synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, right? So the easiest example, or one of the easiest examples, is analytic a priori judgments. These are definitions, right? So, like I mentioned earlier, if you know I'm going to the protest for the first time next week, then you know I'm not going this week. This just means if you understand the definition of the terms in the original statement, it is already included. Another example that philosophers really love is they love to say a bachelor is an unmarried man, right? That doesn't really do anything other than state the definition of what a bachelor is. And in fact, that is not confirmed by experience or something like that. That just goes into the definition of what it means to be a bachelor. If you wanted to describe someone who is not an unmarried man as a bachelor, then you would just be changing the definition, which is something that we do all the time, so it's not really a problem, right? But some knowledge just comes purely from definitions, right? How do you know that these are true? You just apply the principle of non-contradiction, right? It would be a contradiction if I'm going for the first time next week, but I also went earlier than that this week, right? That's just contradiction in the temporal terms in particular. Okay, so analytic a priori. There is no analytic a posteriori, right? And this is part of the reason why early modern philosophers prior to Kant tended to conflate these distinctions, right? Is because this is incoherent. Analytic a posteriori. That would be like, it's giving two different sorts of justification, right? On the one hand, if it's analytic, it's supposed to just be true through the principle of non-contradiction. But if it's a posteriori, it's supposed to be true through experience. So analytic a posteriori is a confusion, right? That's why there's an X here. This is a nonsense. This is a contradiction in terms. It's not possible, right? Okay, and so now let's move down here. Then we can explain synthetic a posteriori. These are, things that you know from experience, right? So biological facts about dogs, right? Learning, say, the average lifespan of a certain breed of dog. that is not something that you could ever conceivably discover just by like thinking about it a long time, right? It's just not. All you can do is hazard a guess with the existing knowledge that you have, but none of that is going to tell you what the average lifespan of a certain breed of dog is. So the way that you actually go and you discover that is through experience. In particular, like you either do experiments yourself or you read about other people doing experiments to discover this information. So they learn it just by watching a bunch of cases and then generalizing, right? And so this is synthetic because it amplifies your existing knowledge, right? You're learning more about the world to learn this stuff. But it also is something that you learn from experience itself. So this is going to be like kind of where the vast majority of our knowledge is, right? Okay, but now it's important that we talk about the most important category for Kant, and that's synthetic a priori. Right? What was the deal with him saying that if Hume knew more mathematics, that he would have discovered Kant's critical system? Well, what Kant has in mind is Kant says if you pay attention to like what a mathematical judgment is, then you know for certain that it cannot just be analytic. Why? Right? Well, think about this. This is one example that Kant gives. Kant gives the geometric proposition that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Now, this is clearly a priori, right? It's not something that we just learn through experience, right? It's not something that is contingently true, that we're kind of uncertain of, or anything like that. No. As long as we're working with Euclidean space, you're on a plane, then the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And this holds true a priori, and is always true. And Kant would say, and this clearly amplifies our knowledge, right? That then lets me discover the shortest distance between any 2 points on, any 2 points that I like in space. It clearly amplifies our knowledge. And Kant would say also, thinking about arithmetic, say, 5 plus 3 equals 8 or something like that. I'll go with that example. Kant says you can't think about this as a definition, right? In part because you can define all mathematical numbers in terms of each other, right? So sure, in a certain way, you could define 8 as being that which equals 5 plus 3, but, it would also be that which is 4 multiplied by 2, and 16 divided by 2, and 24 divided by 3, and so on and so forth, right? And so you're not giving the fundamental definition by defining it in that way. And so it's not really a definition at all, right? It just doesn't really make sense to think about mathematical terms as being like definitions, because definitions are about natural terms. And mathematics is about quantitative relationships. And those are two distinct kinds of things. And when I learn more about mathematics, right, I learn about, say how a curve works or something like that, I'm learning about the world, right? This is crucial. I'm learning things. I'm amplifying my knowledge. I'm not just, as Hume seems to want to describe, like trading one kind of language for another or something like that. No. Kant says, and he insists, that learning mathematical facts is learning facts about your experience, and that this is what the great modern scientific revolutions have really shown to us, right? Is that our experience is mathematically explicable. Knowing more mathematical knowledge is knowing more about the world, right? Similarly with physics, right? Whenever I say every action has an equal and opposite reaction, I'm not making a generalization that is a contingent truth about a limited body of knowledge. I'm instead making a synthetic, it amplifies my knowledge, it's crucial to doing physical experiments, a priori knowledge. And so Kant thinks this is what really needs to be interrogated more than anything, is the nature of synthetic a priori judgments and figuring out what is their source of justification. Because clearly mathematics is justified in some way, physics is justified in some way, but metaphysics seems to have a huge problem. And so what we're going to be looking at for next week, and so for the remainder of the class, is Kant's argument for a disanalogy between synthetic a priori judgments in mathematics, synthetic a priori judgments in physics, and synthetic a priori judgments in metaphysics. As it turns out, mathematics and physics can be a science, because they are rooted in some way in their application to our possible experience. Metaphysics, however, is not. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you're having an okay end of the semester. Please email me if you have any questions or any problems with your final paper, if you need an extension. These are the sort of things that it's best to talk to me about as soon as possible. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great week.